now. And yeah, so welcome Dr. Chuck DeGroat. He is author of the Narcissism book we're reading. I had the pleasure of being in one of his courses for my doctoral program, and it was one of the best courses that I had taken, and so grateful to have you as a friend and have you on here, Chuck. And so what we'd like to do, Chuck, is we'd love to throw out some questions about the book, but we'd love to have you share, like, first, like, you know, like, since you've written the book, what's the experience been like for you, and what's the impact that you're seeing on leaders and congregations?
Yeah, well, Roy, were you in the class right as COVID was ramping up? Was that?
Yes, that was us.
I mean, that was such a crazy experience, because literally that week, I think that's the week that Fuller decided to close down. We at Western Seminary decided to close down. We had a like a physicist who grew up in China, was a physicist in China, lived in Wuhan, right? Or Wuhan.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
In the class, who talked to us about his experience in the lab at Wuhan. I mean, it was just a really interesting week. And I mean, I came back and I was anticipating the book launch, and then things started to shut down. So it was a really anticlimactic book launch, which is probably good for a narcissism book. It was sort of a thud, and you know, half of my launch group sort of disappeared. For all I mean, everyone was trying to find toilet paper and stuff like that, and so we were not interested in being online, helping you know, helping get books get launched and stuff like that. So it was a really interesting season getting it launched. It ended up becoming an opportunity to do webinars and have conversations around podcasts and things like that. And so the book actually started to gain some traction. And within that year, you know, Wade Mullen wrote a book on toxic systems, Diane Langberg's book on redeeming power. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer wrote their book. And so there were a number of books about toxic leadership in the church, toxic systems, power. Kristen Dumais, who is a friend out here in this area at Calvin, wrote her book that sort of deconstructed evangelicalism and patriarchy over the last 100 years. And you know, we had sort of been talking even beforehand that the themes of the book sort of go hand in hand, right? I think probably since the launch of this book, what I've learned is there's the kind of psychological stuff that I put into this book, but it's layered with all these cultural components, right, that we can tease out together, of patriarchy and Christian nationalism and white supremacy, and that are all sort of baked into the conversation around narcissism in the church, which often comes up for me when people ask, well, how long has this been going on in the church? 20 years, 25 years? And I want to say, no, this is baked into the church in the West, and the church in North America, right? So I've learned a lot about that, I think, in conversation with colleagues over the last couple of years, you know, that there's a larger conversation to be had around dynamics of narcissism that goes beyond kind of the limited frame that I put it in. So that's a little bit of what I've been learning, experiencing.
That's the cultural components that you're raising, you know, patriarchy, Christian nationalism. Reading the book, you see like threads of it, but like to hear you say it, you know, to say like these are some of the components that are getting weaved into, you know, this narcissistic system, is just it's mind blowing. So as you're like consulting with churches, are you starting to see people using some of the material in the book to, what's that been like?
Well, I mean, I think for me and for some others who do this kind of work, it's been overwhelming in the sense that, I mean, we're hearing from churches leaders, pastors, denominations, networks, church planning networks. I mean, just literally everyone asking for help. It's this sort of collective moment of reckoning that we're in right now, right? And I would say that on a personal level, there was this initial surge of like helper me was feeling very, very excited in the first few months of COVID. You know, things got shut down. I had a bit more time. Everything was online. There was a kind of spaciousness to my life around that season where I was able to be engaged in conversations. But I think a lot of us who are helpers, however you define that, right? I'm a therapist, but I was a pastor for a long time and a seminary prof now, are pretty worn out. And there's a sense in which I think, Roy, a lot of us, I'll just speak for myself, there's been a lot of triage in the last 2 years. So on the one hand, I get lots of correspondence from people asking about creating new systems to foster healthy leaders, like some of the work that you're all engaged in. I think that people are interested in that conversation. They're interested in Todd's work and Steve Cuss's work and all that kind of stuff, right? But I think the majority of the conversations I have are from people who have suffered under narcissists. They're in systems where they're under narcissistic leadership. More recently, they've been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. They're involved in church planter training, and they're realizing that for the last 20 years, 50% of the planters that they sent out have blown up in one way or another. And so I think a number of us have felt like we're in more of a triage kind of mode, and there's lots of blood, there's lots of pain, lots of trauma. And so now I was just on a conversation yesterday with a few folks around, so what next? We're all really, really tired. Obviously, there's not a one size fits all solution to this. So what do we do?
So I think all of us would echo with like the systems part of it. I'd like to like turn it over to the group. We've been gathering. This is now, I think, our 4th gathering, Chuck, where we like mapped out our books for this session, and so we wanted some accountability and just processing with each other, and it's been great. So I'd love to turn it over to you guys. Some of you filled out some questions, and would love to just turn it over to the group and have you guys ask some of the questions that I sent the questions to Chuck, but I'd love for you to share your own questions with him directly if you'd like. So please have at it. Who'd like to go first?
I haven't looked at the questions. I didn't want to get all up in my head and try to be formulaic. So
perfect.
You know what I mean?
No worries. So who'd like to go first? This is not a shy group, so
it feels like a very humble group.
I was trying to remember my questions.
I can ask your question if you'd like, Suzanne.
Andrew had one. He raised his hand.
Yeah, go for it, Andrew.
Yeah.
Chuck, I really found hope and comfort in your comment on like the spectrum of narcissism, because I'm a type 3 Enneagram, and there's a lot of things that I see in myself when I was reading your book. I told our group after I finished your book, I texted my therapist and said, "When's our next session?" And so I'd like to know, like, in your experience, what are some of the common characteristics and differences when you're looking at that spectrum between style, type, and pathology? Like what are distinct about those, and what are similarities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple of things just before I answer that. One is that one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, while at the same time trying to keep it at a kind of layperson's level, is reframe the narcissism conversation in a more trauma-informed way and non-pathologizing kind of way, if that makes sense to some of you. In other words, we've discovered over the last 10, 15 years how limited the DSM is. And so it can give us symptoms and like boxes to check off. Oh yeah, he checks off this, she checks off that. But it really doesn't account for the developmental aspects of one's story, one's pain, one's attachment, insecure, secure attachment, things like that. And so when we talk about the spectrum, Andrew, we're attentive to the symptoms, how it's showing up, how narcissism might be showing up, but we're really attentive to a person's story, a person's trauma, and how that dysregulation is working in someone's life. And so I say that first just to say, it's when I'm doing that kind of work, of that kind of diagnostic work, I'm looking at multiple things at the same time, right? And so the spectrum really comes from the work of a man named Theodore Milan, and the assessment tool that I use is the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory. And I don't want to get too into it, but he's got several indices that sort of cue someone like me up to kind of the elevated level of narcissism on the spectrum, right? And so we're looking at things like elevated self-image. What's another one? Interpersonal entitlement or something like that. There are several indices, right, that we're looking at that are really important. And part of it is we take an assessment tool like that, and then we ask the question, well, how does this intersect with both your life and story and how you show up in relationship? And so a test isn't going to tell us who's a narcissist and who isn't a narcissist. A test is going to invite us to ask questions about a person's story, how he deals with the dysregulation in his life, how he shows up interpersonally, how other people experience him. And for that reason, it becomes challenging because, I wish a test could tell me who's a, full-blown narcissist and who isn't. But a lot of what we see with narcissism shows up relationally, shows up in systems, as you all are learning, right? Shows up in the impact one has. And so I might see, I'll give you an example. I was doing this work and someone spiked to just about to narcissistic personality disorder. But when I started doing, asking the questions, what I realized was this was a man who was actually pretty in tune with his own story, had been doing a lot of therapy, was sort of caught in his narcissistic style of relating probably 5 or 6 years ago, really humbled by that and began doing the work in therapy, but actually interpersonally as well within the system, actually invited other people into the process. And so now by the time he comes to me, yeah, there's that spike because we learn this at a very early age, right? So that's still kind of a primary way of relating in the world, but he's actually much more humble and much more attuned. And when I connect to some of the people in his life who are aware of this, they say, oh yeah, 6 years ago, he was kind of a bully. And I would have quit, but now I feel like I can follow him because of his integrity and authenticity as a leader, because he's been doing the work. And because he invites us to give him feedback when he does show up in a more bullying way. So I just said a lot of words, and I'm going to stop right there. But that's sort of a roundabout way of saying it's complicated. And I wish a test could tell me a test does tell me where someone is on the spectrum, but it doesn't tell me enough.
Andrew, any follow-up to that or any comments on that?
I think that's great, and it also gives me hope that we can grow. And like you said, who we were 5, 6, 10 years ago doesn't have to be who we are today and who we are in the future. Personally, Chuck, like I said, I'm a type 3, and in your chapter about the different types, one thing that I identified with was the comment you made, like when you're in relationship with a type 3, the type 3 is the winner and you feel like a loser. And that struck me because the feedback I've received before is like, Andrew, we admire you, but you're intimidating. Like the standard that I hold myself to is so high that it's almost intimidating other people. Like they're not good enough to meet my standard. And that's not a conscious thing on my part of like, oh, you're less than me, you need to do better. It's that pressure I feel to be that standard. So I don't know if you have any advice for those of us who are in that type 3, who are so driven to hold ourselves to that standard. How can we minimize that effect on the people that we're leading and interacting with?
Yeah. That's so good. I mean, I think it begins with the work of discovering that the first ones that are intimidated are actually live within you, vulnerable parts of you that you keep at bay, because narcissism is a sort of shame-based style of relating, you might say. And it's compensatory. It's a face, a mask we wear in the world to keep us from feeling small, fearful, ashamed, anxious. Of course, we don't wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to put on my compensatory mask this morning. That's not how it works, right? But when I do the work, and I didn't like doing this work a long time ago, but as I grew into a love for the work, the really beautiful parts of the work are actually discovering the more vulnerable parts of people who are on the narcissistic spectrum, who have over the years kind of put a wall up between them, that mask of narcissism, and those younger parts of themselves that feel small, weak, insecure. I'll often ask a question like, how old do you feel right now? That me feels like he's 6 or 7 years old and he's being bullied on the playground. And so the work begins, at least my work begins in part with understanding how we interact with parts of ourselves that are really young, how we bully ourselves, right? And so when we're out of touch with that inner conversation, well, then other people in our interpersonal conversations are going to experience that for sure. And if you are on the narcissistic spectrum and not self-aware, you will inevitably blame others for that. Well, you're just too weak. I experienced it in one church where I served, where anyone who was intimidated just had daddy issues and had to get over it and grow up, and that kind of stuff, right? Not speaking to you right now, Andrew, but that's why self-awareness and humility is so important. How are you experiencing me? How do I show up?
Yeah, I thought that connection to the Enneagram was really helpful. I'm a 2 with a 3 edge, so I can actually relate to a lot of Andrew's comments as well. There's something about like my 2 that shows up as like pride, like super deep, even like I can do it better than they can. I know better than they can. I even have to get in there and overfunction because like, what if God's not paying attention? So it gets ugly really fast.
Yeah.
And it's just helpful to break that open. And, because I would have said, oh no, I don't do the narcissistic thing. And it's really helpful to look at, oh, this shows up in a lot of different ways. And like, even during COVID, and one of my questions that I came up with is like, how did we were so isolated during COVID and we were doing a lot of triage, but even my own staff team, we found ways that we were super unhealthy in the isolation of COVID. And I was curious about, whether it's your therapist or background or in the academic world, like things you noticed about narcissism and the effects of COVID, but how we experienced in our staff, our personal thing. I just super overfunction. I have another staff person who's super underfunction. And then we got really unhealthy really fast and like learned a way new pattern that now we're like, oh, we got to unlearn that. How did we get there so fast? How did we? And it was some of that like isolation, siloing, pride, like all of that. So that's a messy way of saying that was my experience. I found myself, and I do find myself being way less healthy than I've ever been before, possibly COVID pressure, possibly my own stuff. But what have you noticed since writing the book and then COVID layer that has made you ask questions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is where narcissism evolves, right? And I mean, if we sort of anchor the story in Genesis 3 and we see themes of narcissism even throughout scripture, grandiosity, entitlement, all those privilege, all the kinds of stuff, right? I mean, COVID sort of evolved narcissism. And one of the things I noticed was that, after that pause where we all thought we had a 2-week vacation and we would be back to work soon enough, there was the discomfort of, well, how long is this going to go on for? And that sense that I'm out of control. This is more than I can handle. And that's where people's strategies start to get employed, right? Like in the midst of, that's what you're all learning in the work that you do, right? In the midst of anxiety, where do we go? And we all have our unique directions we take that in. And so that's sort of how narcissism evolved. So I saw a number of pastors who just sort of, me from a distance, with a sense of who they were and maybe some level of relationship, I watched narcissism evolve into this really sophisticated, now video venue for church services live from my home with multiple sites linked up at once. And I'm going to make sure I remain that compelling presence for my audience, and sort of evolved through even technology and COVID. But I think we all found our way to our unique strategies. A lot of us who are helpers, we discovered that we were going to show up in for you no matter what it took. And so now we're breaking our boundaries by offering telehealth, and if and now there's no more boundary between home and office. We're on call 24/7, and so yeah, it showed up in all different kinds of ways as it evolved in us.
Thanks for engaging there.
Yeah.
I definitely relate to that broken boundaries and trying to figure out how to replace some of those or new ways that they need to be evaluated, because the old set of boundaries that was so helpful is not as employable. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Suzanne. Who else? Just your own questions, reflections on the book.
Right. One other thing I was just thinking of is I had a number of conversations during COVID. This may be now a year in, when I obviously knew I was talking to pastors in particular who were riddled with anxiety, but who couldn't talk about anything other than the opportunity, the kingdom opportunity of COVID and these new ways of getting the word out, the message out. And in my work, I'm going to continually sort of subvert that and bring them back to their anxiety and their shame and their overwhelm. And but they just didn't want to go there. And that's whenever we see narcissism, we see that disconnect between the self that we promote, our public self, and that those insecure, ashamed, young, vulnerable parts of us. And so
that's super interesting to hear the frame of, like, this is a kingdom opportunity. Like, this is the time that we're going to make the changes that we've been trying to make. And it comes across as like, what about the reality of like what's going on around us? Families are hurting, families are isolated. So that is that part of like the masking of like, let's stay positive. It's like faux positivity. I love how you use that word. Like, is that like faux positivity?
Yeah. I mean, we all do that one way or another. I think that's what the Enneagram reveals. It's not a personality test, right? As you all know, it really reveals our shadow side, our false self, how we show up in the world in ways that attempt to get needs met, but which actually sabotage our greatest joy, right? And so I think in the midst of these moments when, I end up seeing a lot of pastors for counseling. And so, I get that, like as Andrew does, I'm sure in his own counseling sessions, I get that hour with the pastor who, it takes about 45 minutes to finally say, I guess what I'm really trying to say is I'm exhausted and I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed, and no one can know it because staff rely on me and a congregation relies on me. And 10 minutes from now, when I end this call, I have to lead a meeting and I have to show up with some optimism. And it's that, it's when we can do that for a while, especially when it's our default response. But when we begin to dial into that disconnect and wrestle with our the lack of congruence, or even our lack of integrity, that's when it gets really problematic for people. Like, oh no, what's going to happen? What happens if I continue to go to counseling with Chuck or whoever, and I realize that I'm far more insecure or anxious than I thought I was?
Yeah. And then, like, how do I come back from that? Can I come back from that? Is there hope?
Yeah. I really like that pretty resilient self that I prop up for the world. And they like it too.
Yeah. On that note, they're not on, they couldn't make it. So we had people, those who couldn't make it, they filled out a question. Someone asked, in the book, you have examples of narcissistic recovery, and our friend Carolyn said, but I wonder how you hold on to hope, and if you're seeing a rise in narcissism in general. So, like, I know Carolyn would want to share more about that, but like in these stories that you're sharing about narcissistic recovery, like how do you and how does a system hold on to hope?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, I think it's hard to talk about like a rise in narcissism. That's why I prefer to use the language of the evolution of narcissism, because you look at the stories of the kings, for instance, in the Old Testament, right? And you can talk about narcissism in those stories. But now, let's just say in the last 10 years, I use that language that you just maybe hinted at, Roy, that language of vulnerability, FAUX, which gets it like we've got a new sort of psychologically informed kind of narcissistic leader now who, quick example, I was doing this work a number of years ago with a larger church, and the leader actually invited me in with arms open and said, hey, you can talk to my therapist. You need to know I'm an Enneagram 7. I'm an open book. And so on, sort of on the front end, there was this sense of, oh, this is a person who does his work. And so, okay, so that's good, until I actually sort of convened listening groups with the lead pastor and like 2 or 3 staff at a time. And then I watched how those dynamics played out. And I was like, oh, no. This man is not healthy at all. Is not self-aware at all. And probably has a therapist who sort of bought the shtick, and and so it gives him the thumbs up and the affirmation, but he's not done much work at all. And so the hope is, on a personal level, for me as a therapist, when people are willing to invite me, let's say off stage, behind the curtain, backstage, into their lives, into the more painful moments of their lives, when they're really able to answer that question, how old do you feel when you're in that kind of situation? And they take me to that story of being 7 or 9 or 11 and experiencing the bullying or the sexual abuse, or maybe it was just a kind of a seemingly normal family, but mom was a lawyer and dad was a pastor, and there was this sense of you're going to fulfill the family promise, and we get to do that work together. And there's growing humility and integrity and curiosity. That's really hopeful to me. And I see that happen in the work that I do. But that takes, I would say, on an individual level and on a collective level, and we could tease this out a little bit more, that takes a kind of dismantling of the ego. Now, one-on-one in a therapy session, that we can provide an environment where that can happen. But what does it mean for church, like systemically, for kind of the egocentricity, kind of the narcissistic personality of a church to be dismantled, let alone larger systems that we're embedded in? We use this language of dismantling a lot when we're talking about the systems that we're embedded in. And that's why I think we are in this moment of reckoning, where there's a kind of dying within the institutions, right? Within churches, institutions. Certainly for me, within church planning networks that I've been connected with over the years, there is a kind of dismantling going on. And a lot of people so there's a segment of folks who are doubling down, who are saying, these people who are writing about these things hate the church and they hate pastors, and so they're doubling down. So there's that going on. But then on the other side, there are folks who are saying, yeah, we're willing to do the work because we follow a savior who died and is risen, and so we'll engage in the pattern of the dying and the rising, for the sake of health, for the sake of the king. And that's a bigger conversation, because that's messy. That's really messy within systems, right? And those who are in power are called to surrender power to some degree. And who wants to do that? I as a white male with some power, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to talk about dismantling and surrendering, but I don't want to give up real power in my life, right? So it's costly.
So on that note, I have two follow-up questions on that. One is a few folks have talked about the systems that are creating narcissists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've been learning that it's not just the narcissistic leader, right? Like there's something in the system that's allowing it to fester.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that? And then can you share a little bit about this comment that you made about leaders being the new wave of leaders are psychologically informed? And that almost feels a little scarier to me than when I grew up in the 90s. You had people that were it was the boom of mega church. So how do you do church well, right? And so you had all these, well, here's the things that you do, right? This is how you grow the church, or you have to have right doctrine and right belief.
Mm-hmm.
But now it feels like the pendulum is it's not uncommon to hear pastors sound like psychologists.
Yeah.
And that scares me a little bit, to think that oh, you have the language, but why does this feel FAUX, right?
Yeah.
Or why does this feel effed up? Sorry.
Hold up.
Yeah, that phone up. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about systems, and then maybe a comment on being psychologically informed as faux informed?
Yeah. I'd love to. I'm not going to write a follow-up book to this. Of course, the publisher, when a book does fairly well or catches on, it sort of meets the moment. They all want you to do follow-ups. I'm not interested at all at continuing on. I could tell you more later about what I'm writing on. But if one follow-up I thought about was framing systems around the autonomic nervous system responses to anxiety, fight, flight, fawn in particular. I think there's a freeze pattern too. But when you think about how we respond to anxiety, even culturally, there's a kind of collective fight. And I've seen this in the church planning movements that I've not been a deep part of, but I've often done church planning assessments. I've been a pastor on 2 church staffs that were started as church plants. And there's this sort of fight. It's even exemplified in the language that they use sometimes. The coalition, the alliance, surge. We use this militaristic kind of language. We're gonna take this city for the kingdom of God. I was talking to a city center church planner not too long ago who said, 20 years ago when I planted my church, there was this sort of conquest mentality baked into a North American mindset that this is a secular city that we need to take back for Jesus, right? And then he said about 5 years ago, a pastor from a historically Black church came to him and said, well, my great granddad was a pastor in this town, and my granddad was a pastor in my. Why didn't you come to me and ask what has God been doing in this city for the last 150 years, right?
Yes, yes.
So there's a kind of fight. That's one way systemically, collectively, we organize ourselves. And we justify it with kingdom language. I think that there are also, and I give examples of smaller churches that exemplify this, a kind of flight mentality. This is sort of historically, this is the Essenes in scripture. This is movements that go out into the wilderness, or these are people who, these are maybe churches that are like more like fortresses that are like, we have the truth. And none of the rest of you understand the gospel the way we understand the gospel. And our little, patch of capital T truth is, we're the only ones who've got it figured out, and so they're organized more around who they've defined as out and who is in, right? And I think there's a kind of fawning narcissism collectively that looks a little bit more like a kind of nice, polite, maybe third way, middle way, centrist,
Right.
we want both sides to hear one another. We just want everyone to get along. And it's not a true gospel reconciliation. It's not a true pursuit of justice. It's more like I don't like that we're all fighting in our church. We don't get into politics. We just talk about the gospel. We keep our eye on Jesus, and we just want everyone to feel welcome here, and yet once you get a little bit closer, you realize that no, not everyone is welcome here. And there is a kind of, we're centered more around our fawning than we are around the gospel, and so that would be a follow-up that I would love to tease out in terms of systems and how we collectively arrange ourselves. I could say more about that, but I'll stop there.
Well, I'd like to hear from the group, because I think this is like, we're diagnosing systems now, right? You're using flight, fright, fight, fawn. And I remember in your conflict course, you talking about the Attendees as this is the flight group, right? Like, we're just going to huddle together out in the desert. We're going to stay close to, Jesus. And we don't want to be tainted by, the world, so to speak. So it sounds like this could be a good, like, diagnosing tool with a congregation, and why a congregation would gravitate to someone who's a fighter, right? If this is alliance, if this is coalition, like, we're going to take back the city, right? Yeah. We're going to show them. And so now they're propping up this leader that's saying, this is who we want, right? Is that kind of what you're alluding to?
That's right. I mean, and when you and I were in that course, remember we used Peter Senge's iceberg model, right? Where we went below the waterline. We looked at, there's these symptoms that we see in certain churches, like a symptom would be, well, my pastor kind of bullies me, or a cluster of staff are aligned against another cluster of staff, but you've got to go beneath the waterline, right? To the patterns that are exhibited, the structures that enable it, that are, whether our polity or our doctrines or toxic theologies that sort of enable these things to happen. And then the mental models below, and that's where you begin to tease that out, that the language of, that we use of God is growing his kingdom, and we're a tool in God's, whatever it is, it actually, the mental model is more of that fight conquest kind of model. You get down to it eventually, and you realize that, we've got, and this is where I think the model of the autonomic nervous system and fight, flight, and fawn is helpful. That actually this is a way of dealing with our anxiety about in ourselves and in the world. That oftentimes, when I work with church planters, they kind of, when they go into a particular, let's say they go into a particular context, a city or something like that, they sort of, they're attuned to the unique anxiety of that place. This is a place where, only 4% are churched, and suddenly everyone in the room is sort of like, we've got to do something about that, and this is a place where people have given themselves over to godlessness and said, we've got to do something about that, and so, I mean, our anxiety is sort of preyed upon for the sake of the mission. All this is happening subtly and unwittingly, right? And this is the work that, of course, we talked about in that class that we tease out in consultancy and stuff like that when we're actually allowed to go beneath the waterline. I would say a lot of the churches don't want you to go beneath the waterline. Like, we paid you to say nice things about us, not
yeah. Any thoughts or comments from the group on this?
So I'm fascinated by the interplay between the need of the person who's in a role, who's then fulfilling whatever this underlying need they have, but that the congregation is also, or the system is actually looking for something really specific.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it's not, so it's not in a vacuum,
No.
right? That these things can't, and so I'm fascinated by that. And then I just spent 2 days with a group of pastors out in Northwest Iowa who we invited together, whose overwhelming statement was, we are exhausted.
Yeah.
And just the exhaustion of trying to meet that, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is what you're looking for. I'm trying to be that thing. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's a really great fit and it feeds itself, but sometimes it's also just a really exhausting fit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's interesting. I mean, that's, if you look at scripture, like Israel asked for the king, they demanded a king that they could lead sort of in their image, right? And I think that's what happens in a sense within systems. And so we've seen this play out at Willow Creek. Like, in the book, I don't tell particular stories, you'll notice, because I just didn't want it to be a tell-all, but you sort of saw this happen with Willow Creek, where the job description essentially asked for the same kind of pastor as Bill Hybels, and so they didn't do that deep systemic work to say, how did we enable this, or how do we practically ask for that kind of leader? Yeah.
Chuck, could you tease out the difference between charisma and charism and narcissism?
Oh, wow. I'm not, I haven't thought in those kinds of categories. I think that's helpful, just initially hearing you say that, because I guess I think of a charism as a gift, right? And I don't at all think charisma is in and of itself problematic. I think I was just talking to Andrew a few moments ago. I mean, 3s, 7s, some 8s, are noticeably charismatic, right? And I do think that there is this, one of the dangers I would say in the book has been, for some it's been weaponized. Like I wrote a book that I hoped would nuance the conversation on narcissism and actually present a path forward that's hopeful, actually help people see that narcissism isn't definitive of a person's deepest sense of self, right? And yet I watch it weaponized. People use the language, even after they've read the book, people use the language like, oh, look at how charismatic he is. He must be a narcissist, No, I love that about 3s and 7s and other 2s, I love the charisma. I love the optimism that isn't necessarily charismatic. I do think we need to ask ourselves the question, so charisma isn't the problem, but what's the fuel? That's what the Enneagram ends up getting at. What's the need that fuels this way of showing up in the world, right? And so there are people who are, Roy, I think you're charismatic. I mean, the way you sort of launched into our time together, the way you show up in various spaces, but that can become a sort of false self that isn't a spiritual gift. But a mask we wear to draw people in and to get ego needs met. And do you sense the difference there, right? And so we just have to sort of tease that out from a kind of developmental perspective, and I think we tease that out in relationship and honest conversations. Like I would trust that if you all thought that Roy was just wearing a mask, that eventually you'd sit down with Roy and say, hey, can we have a conversation with you about how you show up?
Which is why I love you've said it a few times now, is how do I experience myself? How do others experience me?
Yeah.
This need for community. I mean, we talk, churches talk a lot about community, and it could mean 1,000 different things to everyone. But we do need a few people in our lives where we can say, like, how do you experience me? I've certainly, I'm in my 40s now. I'm actually starting to have less shame about my charisma, and I'm starting to be less apologetic about it. I had seasons in my life where I didn't want to be, where I really wanted to be on the stage because I know how to work a room. You know, I just do.
Yeah.
I think the more I started owning that, the more I was like, oh, I don't want to be on the stage now. And I don't want to be like on in these platforms where I'm going to get attention because it makes me feel certain ways. But then I started asking God, like, if you've made me like this, like, when is this healthy and when is this unhealthy?
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes I have to admit there's a mixture of both happening in the same moment.
Yeah.
You know, and I probably along this line, Chuck, you know, this year that we're in, the first year we were learning about, you know, the difference between technical and adaptive challenges and solutions. You know, we were learning to diagnose systems.
Yeah.
This year is all about like the self, the leader. And so probably as we're wrapping up here, you know, what encouragement would you have for us, like as we're exploring, you know, our own anxieties and trying to be people that are, you know, you use the phrase, you know, dysregulated, right? Like, how do we become self-regulated? How do we keep doing this work as pastors and invite, like, do you have any examples of a few pastors that you're like, man, like they really took to this, they invited some people into the process?
Yeah. I have loads of examples of pastors who took to the process, and I'm that's maybe surprising to some, you know, because I have gotten pushback from folks who are like, Chuck, you refuse to call evil what is evil, and write off people who are narcissistic. But I've just been doing the work for too long and seen too many people change. Now I have many examples of people who refused to do the work and who doubled down, right? But yeah, you know, so any of you familiar with Patricia DeYoung's work on chronic shame? Is that familiar to any of you? What's really significant about her work, you may remember that I wrote a chapter on rage and shame in The Narcissistic Pastor. And I really do believe, and I think this comes with a lot of psychological and neurobiological weight, you know, that shame is the root of narcissism or narcissistic injury, what we call narcissistic injury, early childhood attachment injury, ego injury is at the root, right? And so what Patricia DeYoung does is she teases out 3 faces of shame, to use that language of faces again. And what's interesting, Roy, is that in ministry, the 3 faces are the dysregulated face of shame, the deficit face of shame, and the face, what she calls the face of dissociative shame. Now, the first one, this may be too technical for all of you, but I think it's really fascinating. The first one, the dysregulated face of shame, those are people who live in fragility and dysregulation a lot. And those folks generally don't go into ministry. They don't make it through seminary, or their life is just too dysregulated. The face of dissociative shame, the third one, those are the full-blown narcissists bordering on sociopaths. Like they have no capacity for empathy whatsoever. And that's pretty black and white. And they're really tough to do the work with. But the middle one, the deficit face of shame, is where, I can almost say that, like, confidently, that the large majority of ministers wear the deficit face of shame. And that's basically a fairly regulated you that has managed to kind of compartmentalize your shame and wear this really good public face, but you're constantly sort of shadow boxing because there's that looming voice back there that it's not enough, or if they really knew, or you don't have what it takes, whatever the voice sounds like for you. And I think this is why Brene Brown's work has gained such traction over the last 12, 13, 14 years, is that it speaks to this kind of deficit face of shame that the large majority of us who are, we're fairly successful in what we do, and yet we're constantly shadow boxing with our own shame. And so I think the hope would be to invite people into an honest conversation about this is the second year for you guys, the transformation, right? That I think that we're not just polishing up the false self, the personality, which is a lot of what we did 20 years ago. We took all sorts of personality tests, and we, based whether or not you should be a chaplain or a church planner on your personality. No, now we're actually going beneath the waterline, and we're asking these deeper questions that I think the Enneagram helps us ask, and other tools help us ask. And we're in relationship with people who we can be really honest with. One of my friends, you're up, who's that? Edie? Is that how you say your name, Edie? You were in Northwest Iowa. I don't know if you met Brian Keepers, but
oh, I know Brian.
Oh, good. We
were in seminary together.
Yeah. Well, so he's one of my close friends, and Brian's the kind of person who I can sit with, and I take the mask off really quickly with Brian, and we could have a conversation about the parts of me that showed up to this meeting, the insecure parts of me that felt like I have nothing to offer these. I 5 minutes before I got on, I don't know that I have anything to offer besides what I wrote in the book. And why is Roy even asking me, And then there's the part of me that wants to put on the grandiose, like, expert hat, and just be like, well, just show up. You really got this. I mean, you know more about this than most people do. And there, I'm off to the races 5 minutes before our time together. And so the hope, Roy, come full circle, is that we're doing that work of paying attention within, and we've got really good people in our lives who can reflect back to us what they see, how they experience us, what it's like. They can even ask proactive questions, like a Brian Keepers can kind of press in and say, I know you wrestle with this. So how did it go when you went on the call with the Fuller people? That's the gift,
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I remember, Chuck, even in our in our class that we took a couple of years ago, you were very hospitable even to share a little bit of what was coming up for you in the class at times. And I don't think you were modeling it. I think you were just like, that's who you are. And I know even for me, like, I'm like, how am I going to interview this guy who, who's written this book, who's impacted us? Like, I started to get into maybe someone else should be interviewing, Chuck, and leading this and guiding this, because my mind goes all over the place. And
yeah.
I had to preach this weekend at an all Black church. And it was a real honor to do that. And I grew up Pentecostal charismatic, and this was a Pentecostal church. And I was like, I'm not, it's called whooping. Like, I'm not a whooper pastor. Like, if I would have stayed in Pentecostalism, I would have turned into that. And then I would have had a nervous breakdown at some point in my life. So I actually talked about the spirituality that informs our emotional and relational health and well-being. And it was probably a congregation of 75 folks or so, and all Black. Like, the majority of people came up to me afterwards and they said, I have never heard the Bible explained the way that you just did. And they were saying, I had all this anxiety coming in because of some things I'm going through. And to hear you talking, it's okay to talk about anxiety, is it was just such an uncommon thing for them to do. Right. And I talked about yeah, I'm Pentecostal and I believe in Pentecostal power, but I also love therapists who give us practices, right? So I talked about the power of the practice, right? But I remember finishing my sermon and I sat down, and immediately the voices of you went too long. No one heard this. Yeah. What are you doing up there? Yeah. And I remember having to breathe to work through the questions of saying, oh, you know what? I did go too long. Let me work on that. Yeah, I didn't like that point, but I really like the way this went, right? So I'm there trying to deregulate myself after coming off the stage and people coming up to me. Yeah. And it's, it's showing up, right? We're just trying to show up to ourselves, to God, and to one another. I'm
glad Pentecostals deal with that. I just thought it was the shame-based Dutch Reformed types among us.
Oh no, man! It was tough. Yeah. But I was really grateful for the opportunity. Okay, so a couple of things that people, oh, you already answered it, right? What are you working on now? The Body Keeps the Story. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, do you know Bessel van der Kolk's work, The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes.
It's what I think, at the top 10 most important books written in the last 10 years. But I'm thinking of it through the lens of the Christian story and understanding, I think a lot of the work we're doing in trauma these days is around resilience and tapping into our original state, as trauma theorists call it, what Christians might call original goodness. So that's part of it. I'm just working that out.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Suzanne was asking about any book lists that could help us address like healthy systems or anything that you're reading right now.
Yeah.
And maybe I can email you that, and you can, send it.
Let's just email back and forth, and I'll send you some resources if that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Chuck, it's
Yes, because
8:30.
we all need more to read, Roy.
Yeah, right.
No,
Right.
this is for the future, Edie. Like,
Gotcha.
you
No, I'm already collecting books. Like, as Chuck is talking, I'm already collecting books. So no,
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah, Chuck, we're so grateful for you. Thank you so much for taking time to meet with a bunch of D.Min misfits that are trying to figure this out. And really thank you for the work that you're doing. And we'll stay in touch. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate
Thank
you guys. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.